Let's talk about 9 of the units in Warhammer 40k that gain the most out of the balanced data slate. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k rules updates once more. And in this video I just wanted to talk about a selection of units that seem to have done particularly well. Not necessarily an exhaustive list or anything like that, but maybe just a few units that are looking far more standout for their armies than they were before the update. Let's go through each one in turn, roughly where it was before and how it's looking now. First up, for the Astra Militarum, the mighty Rogal Dorn battle tank is looking better than ever. I'd argue that it was already really quite usable for the guard before. 18 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save is pretty fine for 260 points that it was already, particularly with its once per game cancel failed save rule, which could help protect it against some of the scariest stuff around, things like Gladiator Lancers or other similar big damage guns. Then just beyond that, it's a fairly general purpose firepower tank, a main gun with d6+3 strength 12 AP2 damage 3 shots, then 2 multi-melters, a pulverizer cannon with a bunch of strength 9 damage 3, an auto cannon, a stubber, and then a couple of hull-mounted stubbers or melters. Certainly can be a bit of a psychological weapon as well when you're sitting through firing 6 different profiles at your opponent. They maybe didn't tend to get used in top tier tournament play crazily often. Tank heavy guard just wasn't enormously common prior to the update, and often the tanks that were used tended to be higher AP things, like perhaps Demolisher tank commanders, but I feel like this thing has now been taken to massively the next level in the update. It got a very solid points cut, going down to 240 points, so minus 8% there. That feels super meaningful on a miniature that was already genuinely quite usable before, in my opinion. The newborn soldiers, I guess, might make it a little bit less good for the lethal hits if it's stationary, but for the most part in 40k you generally have to be moving around. You can't normally afford to have 250 points worth of tank just literally sat where it is, at least in terms of fairly busy tournament terrain layouts. You need to be pushing up to get lines of sight and maybe getting onto objectives. As a squadron unit, gaining the lethal hits on enemy tanks and monsters seems like an overall win, particularly as this thing has so many mid-strength profiles. Potentially 6 shots worth of melter goodness, and some more mid-strength with the autocannon and the pulverizer on top of that. Getting all that against hard targets on the move seems like a really nice thing. Otherwise, its tank shot got way better as well. You'll normally be throwing 12 dice rather than 9, so an extra mortal wound if you do need to commit to run the foe over. And finally, it might just be a little bit of an easy target for things like Lord Solar orders. Now, it's a bit more pointless to be ordering artillery around, then it means that you can just be broadcasting his orders to the main battle tanks. Realistically, this was always getting an order, but maybe feels like one of the best buffing units is a bit more readily available to help out tanks. Perhaps for downsides, its sheer size can still be a bit problematic. Some gaps it might not be able to fit through, and that might limit it on some tables, but I must admit it would be a pretty intimidating wall of adamantium to be facing 3 of these on the board, which seems quite doable at 720 points. Just an awful lot of defense and a whole load of damage, and the guard do have some stratagems that are well worth using on this. If you need to focus down the enemy, then Fields of Fire could well be worth the 2 CP if you've got multiple tanks on target. Next up, and sticking with the big heavy guns but for the greater good, we've got the Broadside battlesuit. Unlike the Rogal Dorn, I feel like this one had been kind of priced out of usefulness before. Initially people were really hyped for them when they saw the new tower rules, particularly with Montcard giving it lots of mobility, but then Games Workshop went and put the price up by far more than people were expecting, going all the way up to 110 points. Now though, Games Workshop basically swapped it back to 90 points base, an interesting, slightly variant points thing depending on whether or not you're taking 2 or 3 of them. It's 90 points for 1, 180 points for 2, and 300 for 3, so basically the third one is paying 120 points for a broadside. I guess the theory there is that if you've got a big unit of 3 of them, then they're a bit more efficient for things like guiding. So if this price tag does remain the same into the future, I feel like 2 is probably going to be optimal at 180 points. 180 points is easily enough to be worth guiding, maybe by stealth suits perhaps, and sometimes 3 was overkill anyway against certain targets, particularly light vehicles that 1 or 2 might well have popped the tank. For the 2 of them, 180 points versus 220 is a massive 18% points cut. I feel like that's easily enough to flip it from being a kind of weak unit, at least compared with hammerheads and things, to be really quite a strong unit again, particularly in Montcar for the advance and shoot, laying down very scary fire with strength 12 AP4 and damage d6+1 heavy rail rifles, with the heavy and the devastating wounds. It also got a slight peripheral buff to its mortal wound defense as well, that now works against devastating wounds as well, which on the whole were far more common than mortal wounds, so that's kind of great. and I guess it's probably a winner by proxy of the Hammerhead getting nerfed. That went up a big 15 points from 130 to 145, and it feels after that bit of rebalancing, the Hammerhead's probably going to be the slightly more optimal unit. Lots of good news for the tower though, between this and all their crisis suit variants dropping down as well though. Definitely a good day for the battle suits of the greater good. Back to the Imperium, and for a unit that didn't change in cost, Canis Rex won out a surprising amount in this update. He's 435 points and was already considered perhaps the single best Titanic Knight for the Imperials in terms of regular competitive play. A fair few of the others are definitely usable, but none of the rest really add the same sort of big threat for the points as him. As a Questoris, he gets the 22 wounds with a 6+ feel no pain and Iron Shield, plus you have the potential preserving of victory points and things with Sir Hector getting out. And then he gets a Las Impulsor and a boosted Gauntlet and Freedom's Hand. The big thing is though that he hits on a 2+, unlike the rest of the knights, and for some reason he gets a sustained hit on a 5+, which when you're the same sort of cost as a fair few of the knights is just a crazy damage advantage, even if he does pass up things like a top-mounted Storm Spear pod. Besides, the Carapace weapon is just not really all that far off double damage compared with a Knight Preceptor at base. A few knights got points adjustments in the updates, but it maybe feels like Canis Rex won the most. The -1 command point to stratagems thing had a big positive effect on him, mainly because he was locked to only using that on battle tactics, and that meant it was basically command point reroll and once per game shoulder the burden, which definitely was a good stratagem, and I guess that is a small nerf for him. You would have to pay 1 CP for that, but I feel like given that you can now use this to trigger rotate ion shields for free, or get a free tank shock when he charges in, then I feel like he's won overall. Perhaps more importantly than that though, the big knights gained the super heavy walker rule ability, allowing them to smash through bits of terrain. Basically just go straight through anything that was over 4 inches in height, which would have blocked their path normally, so he can just shoulder his way straight through ruins at the small chance of taking battle shock, though it's only 1 in 6. For the Chaos Knights it's certainly helpful, but if they desperately needed it, they could buy it in with a stratagem. For the Imperial Knights it's just kind of new, and it means that you can at least be fairly sure that big knights aren't just going to get penned in their own deployment zone unless the opponent does some very, very big move block shenanigans. You can't just put a small chaff unit in between 2 ruins and call it a day anymore. That's just definitely a massive advantage for a massively powerful model getting into melee or just where he needs to be on the board. I guess the other small nerf for him is tank shock. He'd be averaging 4 mortal wounds now rather than just under 6. But given he can potentially do it for free isn't the worst thing. Overall, good news for Canis Rex, and it's also looking like a pretty interesting choice for a bunch of Imperial allies as well, never mind just knights. Next up, for the denizens of the Warp, all of the greater demons got a massive win out of the data slate, though perhaps the base Bloodthirster is a fairly standout one, just given the sheer amount of things that affect him from this. He's a big scary, toughness 11, 18 wound monster with a 4+ invulnerable save, and as you expect hits like a bit of a truck in melee, 7 attacks if you take the Great Axe with strength 16, AP 4 and damage d6 +2, plus a bunch of mortal wounds on the charge, and then has a +1 to hit for nearby Khorne demons, who generally aren't an uncommon sight in competitive lists. Despite that, I think I would have said he was usable versus the other greater demons rather than standout, though Games Workshop do seem to have let him catch up a bit, given that he dropped down from 320 to 305 points. I feel like the point swing is pretty meaningful, dropping 5% off is a really good start, and then all of the greater demons gained that Shadow of Chaos aura for everything within 6 inches for their chosen deity. The fact that the Bloodthirster and Scarbrand get it for Khorne things is super big. Blood Crushers, Rend Masters, and Flesh Hounds were all fairly common sights in competitive lists, and that could allow them to deliver them into battle for really short charges in the middle of the table, not needing to worry whether you can defend midfield objectives or anything. And you could even have a Bloodthirster tag teaming with Scarbrand, potentially have one of them deep strike the other, most likely the standard Bloodthirster deep strike Scarbrand into attack range. On top of that, the Shadow of Chaos gets a bunch of personal benefits for the Bloodthirster himself. He'll always get to heal wounds if he passes a battle shock test. He can always elect to advance and charge for 1 CP, which is pretty amazing for a dedicated melee mauler like him. He debuffs the enemy battle shock when he's charging into their ranks, and his relic Argath seems well worth taking now, as it will basically always give him an extra 2 attacks and 2 strength, and that seems absolutely great on the Great Axe in particular. Going from 7 attacks to 9 attacks on that terrifying profile is rather great. I feel like maybe he was the single biggest standout winner out of the bunch, though basically all the greater demons that were already very strong are better. Certainly still seems like that big feel no pain great unclean one that's very cheap for his defense. He still doesn't look like he's going to be any less auto-include. For the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes, we've got the Venatari Custodians. These guys are the jump pack guys, often being fielded with their lance weapons in 10th edition. Prior to the data slate, they were 66 points per model effectively, 200 points per 3, and they help to solve the problem of how you get all your golden wounds across the table nice and quick, and the Guardian Spears into melee on the targets they most need to. They move a lot faster at base, a 10-inch move and fly is really handy, and then they've got free rapid ingress as well. So if you put them in Deep Strike Reserve, you can hopefully have them drop somewhere on the board that's nice and safe, and then use that good movement to get the charge on what they want. When they get there, that Guardian Spear profile has Lance on this unit, so it means they're extra devastating on the charge, and they still get the tanky defensive profile of Toughness 6 with a 2+ save. In the data slate, the Custodians got better in general. The Shield Host rule now applies every single turn with your favourite damage buff out of the 2, so they will just hit harder at base anyway, and devastating wounds becoming mortal wounds again is pretty good for the Talon's core rule and the reactive mortal wound stratagem from the Shield Host, both of which just give the Custodians a lifeline against the thing that should destroy them the easiest. What made these super stand out though was they also dropped from 200 points all the way down to 165, so it's essentially 55 points now rather than 66, and that's a big 18% points cut. Again, I feel like, given that that was a unit that was fairly usable in its niche role, this just seems pretty spectacular combined with the general Custodians buffs. You're now only paying 10 points more than Guard or 5 points more than Wardens for a very good chance of getting the charge on something that you'd struggle to catch otherwise, and getting the lance melee when they get there. Certainly feels to me that you'd be hard pressed not to want to include one unit of these. I guess it's diminishing returns after one unit has used rapid ingress for free, but also still doesn't seem like the absolute worst unit if you did put a few of them on the table just on the board anyway. They don't have the durability of the Wardens or the cheapness and the damage boost of the Custodians, but moving a fair bit quicker and getting lance melee are both good things. Next up, maybe the Hernkyn Yaegirs don't necessarily count as an improved unit, but given what people were expecting for their points cost, these guys won super big in the balanced data slate. We'd had a few weeks where Games Workshop had basically shown off their 40k datasheets but not given them a points cost yet. They're kind of a low threat datasheet, but a useful utility one, 10 toughness 5 models with a 5+ save each, and it looks like the plasma knives were the way to go with them, 20 attacks with strength 4 and AP 2, likely sobbing out a couple of them though for the fun missile launcher and sniper rifle. They weren't going to change the world on a damage front, but given the infiltrator rule they're super important for Leagues of Votann. It means that you can screen back the enemy, so your Sagitors and Hernkyn Pioneers are guaranteed to be able to use their scout move to go into the midfield if they want to. And that seemed like it's a rule that could well be worth accessing even if you're paying a tax for them. And they also get quite a fun reactive movement rule, potentially being able to back away from oncoming enemy charges or hide behind terrain, and that's really useful to have on a mid-board unit. I feel like people were speculating around about 100 or so points for these guys. Perhaps for a somewhat equivalent unit in another faction, Orc Commandos are 135 points, and they've got similar toughness to enemy firepower. They do pack a bit more of a punch in melee with the knob with the power claw. I feel like at that cost for the Orcs, they're in a bit of a niche role where some people choose to use them, paying a premium for the mid-board screening, though most lists choose not to use them. In the balanced data slate as well, the Sisters Novitiate, another example of a 10 model infiltrator squad. In context of that, being an 80-point unit is really quite a massive win. That's closer to the points cost that you'd usually expect to find the 5 model infiltrator type squads, and having an extra 5 bodies in that unit for extra objective control and to absorb more enemy fire really seems like a pretty great thing for them. They're still not going to do crazy things in the damage game, though if they do happen to get the charge against the double judgment token type units, those plasma knives certainly could stack a fair bit of damage. They just seem overall massive winners though for being a screening unit for the Sagitors and just having a unit in the midfield to start on objectives and maybe do early game secondaries if you need it. For optimized lists, they look thoroughly auto-include at 80 points. I wouldn't be too surprised if some lists choose to take 2 units. Next up, back for the Imperium, Dark Angels basically had 2 different big unit winners. Deathwing Knights with their buff damage output, and the same for Inner Circle Companions. I feel like in reality they probably both gained kind of similarly, though I felt like talking about the Inner Circle Companions for this one. Their rule was a fairly simple but effective change. Previously they were 90 points for 3 guys, and their damage output wasn't quite as bad as the internet might have been claiming, I think, but they were just a bit limited with AP-1 weapons. It meant that if they ever attacked anything that had a high save, there was a good chance that they were going to bounce. In the dataslate they got two main improvements, getting AP -2 on their primary weapons, both in the strike and the sweep mode, and then a solid 5 attacks on the sweep mode. So we've either got 4 attacks per guy at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2 with lethal hits, or 5 attacks on the sweep mode with sustained hits 2, or with damage 1. That's a profile that's going to just absolutely ruin hordes. I think with that change, given the inbuilt lethal hits, they're just fairly solid, better damage output than Blade Guard. Maybe kind of similar against standard marines, which they kill well anyway, but certainly far better against tough stuff given the higher strength and the lethal hits, certainly against hordes with the sweep mode, and also against characters with the +1 to hit against those units. Unlike Blade Guard, they don't have to buy in a lieutenant for the lethal hits to keep them general purpose as well, they already have that at base, and it means that you could give them something else interesting, potentially something like a Chaplain, Captain or Judas here, or one of the Dark Angel's unique characters. Azrael certainly does feel like a good on-paper fit with them, given the 4+ invulnerable save, though he's kind of awesome anywhere. Even unbuffed by any characters or stratagems or things though, they average around about 8 slain Orc Boys, 4 slain Space Marines, or 6 wounds to a toughness 10 vehicle. I think that damage output is easy enough to have them interesting, particularly when you can back it up with another character of some sort. And they've also got some other peripheral gains as well. They can ride in an Impulsor with a character for a cheap transport for 7 models, and the Inner Circle Task Force, if you're choosing to use it, got improved as well. They might have a bit better access to wound rolls on more objectives. Overall, I think Games Workshop did pretty well with them. I think the AP change was likely enough to change them from being very low threat to quite a high threat unit that you need to be wary of. Next for the Genestealer cult, previously the Achilles Ridgerunner was numbering amongst one of the strongest datasheets in the index, but now both the codex has come out and all the points changes have been seen. It looks like Games Workshop have basically flipped it around to being the single best and most auto-include datasheet in the codex. It's a fast-moving vehicle with 8 wounds at toughness 7 and a 3+ save. It can move fast and scout up the board if you need it, though often it tended to be a bit more of a backfield lurker. And its main job was to hand out an extra AP- debuff, helping out your ranged units get extra AP against one critical target. People often tended to like using the mortar so they could put that AP debuff exactly where they needed it, though I feel like the heavy mining laser was maybe a little bit underrated. Pretty big to still be able to hand out that same debuff, but also get essentially D3 las cannon shots into the bargain. Its supporting rules were also both great as well, either getting Ballistic Skill 3+ for extra reliability, or handing out Ignore's cover as well. Pretty much every list chose to run them pre-codex when they were like 80 odd points or so, and then they only got better from there. Last balance updates they dropped down to 75 points, and that seemed like a really bizarre change to be honest. Out of all the units in the index they certainly weren't one that really needed a buff, and then the codex doubled down on making them great, as that AP-1 debuff also applies in melee as well. So it could do things like AP-3 Aberrants or Pure Strain Genestealers or Heavy Rock Weapon Acolytes. Given how the codex has changed, that looks like it's going to be far more important than it would have been before. A bunch of ranged things did lose out a bit, and a bunch of melee things made gains. And it's also, curiously enough, now it's shaping up to be one of the better anti-tank damage dealers in the entire codex. Given its buffing rules and its other advantages, D3 Ballistic Skill 3+, essentially las cannon shots, definitely don't seem like the worst thing to have. That's still not really its main role versus that great AP debuff, but its damage output is far better than you'd expect for this kind of support unit. It even made the lesser taken flare launcher option a bit better, and if you happen to be trying to make Outlander work, then it's got even more buffs and support. Overall does look a bit crazily strong. I'm not sure if people will be tempted enough to spam lots of these, but it feels like anything up to 3 individual ones seems like it's kind of impossible to go wrong with right now, and it certainly looks like you could take more. Finally, the AdMech had all manner of things buffed, both through their core rules and through their datasheets, but I feel like on first impressions, it's just really quite cool to see the Ruststalkers get genuinely scary again, jumping up from being perhaps one of the worst units pre-codex, without enough threat to make them count, to a genuine menace if you do use the buffs that they have going for them. Ruststalkers are 2 wound units with a 5+ invulnerable save that can move fairly fast. They go 8 inches with a +1 to advance and charge, or a bit more near battle line. At 60 points, they were basically kind of chaff interference units that you couldn't count on to do much damage. Now they have gone up to 75 points, but that still feels like an okay place for them in terms of defense. And still maybe cheap enough as a unit to rush out, do some big damage to something, and then it doesn't matter too much if they die in return. For their weapon upgrades, they got Strength 5 weapons up from Strength 4, pretty massive against Marine equivalents, and anything that's less than Toughness 10. They gain +1 attack on all their profiles. Previously, they had either 3 or 4 for the bulk of the squad, and then the Conqueror Doctriner means that they can actually get some serious melee help from that now, so you can potentially get +1 weapon skill, just passively from the core army rule, and then if they happen to be next to a battle line unit that can be spammed and probably should be in new AdMech lists, then they'll either go up to AP2 or AP3 depending on the one that you selected. Just looking at their damage output, these guys are spectacularly savage now. Just 5 of them near a battle line unit in the Conqueror Doctriner with the Transonic Blades as an example get this damage. You go through hordes really quickly with 11 slain toughness 3 guardsmen or termagant bodies, about 9 wounds to Space Marines which feel like a fairly optimal target, a big 7 wounds to Terminators which is pretty massive. Definitely could be threatening to wipe out a base unit of 5 of them if you had a 10 Ruststalker block. They do fall down a bit flat against vehicles without any other support, only doing around about 3 wounds to them due to wounding them on a 6. Basically provided you have other things to be able to punch up against vehicles, it seems they will do really quite well to kill their points in a single round worth of combat. I feel like this is pretty great damage output for a unit that moves really quite quickly, can make very long charges across the board, and have got some pretty good options from detachments and things. In Sicarian Hunter cohort, they can advance and charge, which is pretty big. If they can perhaps coordinate with some battle line units getting out of transports alongside, it could be something like a 22-inch potential charge threat range, which is pretty massive when you can just delete infantry units wholesale like this. Overall, I think it's pretty cool that they're looking very elite and scary again. I think I'll leave that there for this one though. Let me know what you make of the units and the changes down in the comments below, and let me know which units you think are looking best after all these changes. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.